town of Belfast in 1800 had a predominantly Presbyterian population, many of whom had been active only 2 years earlier in the famous 1798 rebellion, the first rebellion that aimed to overthrow the monarchy in Ireland, establish an independent Irish republic, and end the legal discriminations then in place against Irish Presbyterians and Catholics. A particular focus of their ire had been the Irish Parliament that met in Dublin, and which was dominated by the Ascendancy, the collective name given to the Irish aristocracy, nearly all of whom at this stage were members of the Church of Ireland, the regional branch of Anglican Episcopalianism. In response to the 98 uprising, the government in London decided to abolish the Dublin Parliament and unite the two parliaments, with Irish constituencies henceforth sending representatives to Parliament in London alongside English, Welsh and Scottish MPs. This was achieved by a law called the Third Act of Union, passed in 1800 and coming into legal effect on New Year's Day 1801, which was also technically the birthday of the United Kingdom, as the Third Act of Union legally changed the country's name from Great Britain to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, which lasted until 1921, but that's a story for another microphone. The Act of Union of 1800 ultimately helped take the vim and vigour out of Presbyterian radicalism in the north of Ireland. Many of them were so delighted to see the end of the Ascendancy Parliament in Dublin that they became enthusiastic supporters of the new political system established by the Union, calling themselves Unionists. The Ascendancy continued to be called the Ascendancy even after they were no longer in the Ascendant. They were not quite out for the count, however, and the Ascendancy continued to exert a great deal of influence in Irish politics, especially in the north, with the generation born in and around the Union, as they ditched the nostalgia of their parents' generation to embrace the Unionist cause as their own. Perhaps the most famous or notorious of that generation in and around the Act of Union was the second Marquess of Londonderry, which brings us to the first of our 9 tales. Chapter 1. Lord Londonderry's Suicide. On the 13th day of August 1822, the town of Belfast woke to the news that the Marquess of Londonderry had slit his throat. The 53-year-old Robert Stewart, 2nd Marquess of Londonderry, had been staying at his country estate in southeastern England, Woollet Hall, when he walked into his dressing room, picked up a knife, and killed himself. His English wife, the famous Georgian socialite born Lady Amelia Hobart, had been so concerned about her husband's mental well-being in the days preceding his suicide that she and their servants had tried to hide every possible sharp object, fatally and fatefully missing the small knife hidden by the Marquess. Britain's new King George IV, having seen the Marquess's distress firsthand at their most recent meeting, had dispatched a personal note to the Marquess that read, "Remember how dear your health is to the country and above all to me." Coming from Scotland, the King's letter reached Woollet after Londonderry's death, which was discovered by the Marquess's personal physician, Charles Bankhead. Dr. Bankhead had slept in the room next to his patients. That's how worried he was about him. On the morning that the Marquess died, Lady Londonderry had just gotten out of bed. She was chatting with her maid, Miss Robinson, who had passed her a dressing gown, when they heard the doctor's cries. Dr. Bankhead had gone into the Marquess's dressing room, where he saw Lord Londonderry standing, facing out the window over the estate, but with his head tilted up, staring at the ceiling. Without turning round, the Marquess said, "'Tis all over." The Marquess is played throughout today's episode by actor Jake Douglas. The following, with Danny Cunningham as Dr. Charles Bankhead and Paul Storrs as the coroner, is taken from the exact transcript from the inquiry into Lord Londonderry's death.
Did he see you?
No. I was running into the room.
As he fell on me, I saw that he had a knife in his right hand, very firmly clenched.
Did you see him use it?
No.
Are the jury to understand that he used it before you saw him?
I think it was done the instant I put my foot on the threshold of the door. From the nature of the wound, death must have followed in the twinkling of an eye. There could not have been less than 3 quarts of blood which flowed from him in 1 minute. I am quite satisfied that it was not a minute from my entering the room till he was dead. His death was almost instantaneous. He never uttered another word.
Could the wound have been inflicted while you were coming from the door?
Certainly, for as I caught him I saw the knife bloody, and in falling, a burst of blood took place like a torrent from a watering pot. I was unable to support him, and he fell on the floor.
You are quite sure, from all you saw and heard, and from your own good sense, that he used the knife himself?
It is impossible that it could have been done by any other human being. There was no one in the room with him but myself, and death must necessarily follow in half a minute from the infliction of such a wound.
When pressed about the Marquess's mental well-being at the time of his death, Dr. Bankhead replied,
I have not the least hesitation in saying, from knowing the deceased intimately for the past 30 years, that he was perfectly insane.
From what period?
I had noticed a great decline in him for some weeks, in his general habit and in his health, but I was not aware of the mental delusion under which he was labouring till within 3 or 4 days of his decease.
The reaction in Belfast to the Marquess of Londonderry's death was mixed. His family were impossible to ignore, for although the Donegal Chichesters were technically the aristocrats most relevant to Belfast, in reality it was the Marquess of Londonderry's family, the Stewarts, who were the most obvious great family in the region by the 1820s. They were building their new home, Mount Stewart, like a summer palace on the banks of the Ards Peninsula, 14 miles to the east of the city. In Belfast, the Marquess's suicide was therefore big news. But in Belfast, as elsewhere, Lord Londonderry had a varying reputation. To some, the Marquess was a hero who had helped restore stability to Europe and, in particular, ensured through his actions that the French Revolution had not spread into Ireland. But to others, the slim, elegant, and emotionally controlled Marquess was a lying conservative hack who had betrayed Ireland and in particular her Catholic citizens, and who had then facilitated the establishment of a conservative order throughout Europe that had stifled the hopes and dreams of every liberal on the continent. The Marquess's enduring unpopularity with some had been vividly demonstrated in the months before his suicide, when the windows of his house in London were smashed in with rocks thrown by protesters who resented him for his friendship with King George. At the time, the marriage between George IV and his estranged German wife, Caroline of Brunswick, was falling apart, and the people of London had overwhelmingly sided with Queen Caroline. Prominent friends of the King's were targeted by the Queen's squad of sympathisers, whose targets included Lord Londonderry. Matters were not helped by Queen Caroline's sudden death, quite possibly in combined consequence of her alcoholism, her dependence on sleeping aids and laxatives, and long-standing problems with her diet. Even at Lord Londonderry's own funeral a year later, some of the dead Queen's most impassioned loyalists proved that they could hold a grudge by laughing and hissing as the Marquess's coffin passed them by. Others, as mentioned, disliked the Marquess for his politics. At the time of his death, Lord Londonderry had been the British Foreign Secretary, serving in that demanding government post for the past decade. Before that, coming from one of the most prominent families in the ascendancy, he had been Chief Secretary of Ireland in the years immediately after the 1798 rebellion, in which capacity he had been a prominent architect in the drafting and passing of the Act of Union. Unionists thus celebrated Lord Londonderry for the prominent role he had played in creating the Union in the first place. But others, especially some who had fought for the rebels in 1798, remembered that Lord Londonderry, who had held the junior title of Lord Castlereagh while his father, the old Marquess, lived, had also been one of the chief architects of the rebellion's suppression. So despite their shared views on the benefits of the Union, many in Belfast disliked him. Lord Castlereagh had never really warmed to Presbyterians either, despite the fact that he descended from Ulster Scots Presbyterians on his father's side. He distrusted them, feeling that their radicalism and their ability to rebel when things didn't go their way were never too far beneath the surface. As a note, although he was properly the Marquess of Londonderry by the time of his death in 1822, his late father's longevity meant the second Marquess spent most of his life as Lord Castlereagh, and it's that title that continued to be used by many, including friends and foes up to and after his death. As it's the most frequently used in the quotations that are about to follow, I'll be referring to Londonderry as Castlereagh going forward. After Castlereagh's death, a famous poem mocking him was quoted by many of his opponents in both Ireland and England. Written by one of Castlereagh's liberal English critics, it memorably allegorised him as the living embodiment of conservative repression.
I met murder on my way. He had a face like Castlereagh. Very smooth he looked, yet grim. 7 bloodhounds followed him. All were fat, and well they might be in admirable plight. For 1 by 1 and 2 by 2, he tossed them human hearts to chew.
But what had happened to bring death to Castlereagh himself? As Shelley's poem makes clear, Castlereagh was seen by his enemies as a cold, aloof, almost emotionless automaton of autocracy. Beneath the cool exterior, however, there had always been an undercurrent of mental disquiet, hidden away by Castlereagh's preternatural self-control until he could hide it no longer. He was neurotic about his weight for most of his adult life, but the first specific incident that we know of that really raised alarm bells came when he was about 23 years old and temporarily living in Ballyshannon in County Donegal. It was early in his political career, and Castlereagh had been sent to the coast of northwestern Ireland to help with the government's attempts to uncover a conspiracy in the region. He believed, correctly as it turned out, that the emerging Irish Republican movement, who would later lead the 98 Rebellion, were secretly liaising with the new government of revolutionary France. Castlereagh would later refer to this as the conspiracy, and his belief in the links between Irish republicanism and the French Revolution goes a very long way in explaining the ferocity of his hatred towards the rebels of 1798. One night in Ballyshannon, Castlereagh woke up from a deep sleep to be confronted by what he believed was a warning spirit, an innocent, spectral child who transformed in front of his horrified eyes into a blood-soaked, screaming victim with lines of woe, despair and blood over its face. This spectre, Castlereagh firmly believed, had been sent to show him what would happen to Ireland if the values of the French Revolution were allowed to spread to her shores. His first major nervous breakdown happened 8 years after that, in his early 30s, just after the Act of Union was passed. One of the many reasons why Castlereagh had championed the passing of the Act of Union was because he was convinced that its passage would prompt the simultaneous enacting of Catholic emancipation throughout the United Kingdom. Since the downfall of King James II 120 years earlier, Irish and British Catholics had been subject to various discriminations, including being denied the right to vote or sit in Parliament. Castlereagh was certain that with the Act of Union between the Parliaments of Great Britain and the people of a predominantly Catholic kingdom like Ireland, Catholic emancipation would be passed, thereby rewarding and justifying early Irish Catholic support for the Union. But when the Union was passed without Catholic emancipation, Castlereagh sank into a deep depression. Spotting him one day at court, King George III singled Lord Castlereagh out to upbraid him in front of a large crowd for supporting Catholic emancipation, publicly accusing him of being little better than a revolutionary. Mocked by his conservative allies for pushing Catholic emancipation and reviled by his former Catholic allies in Ireland for failing to secure it, Castlereagh seems to have suffered a breakdown. There was another breakdown 7 years later in 1808, although it's not quite so clear what initially prompted this particular phase in his struggle with depression. 7 years later, in 1815, Castlereagh achieved what he regarded as the glory of his career when he represented Britain at the Congress of Vienna, the international diplomatic summit, to decide on the peace settlement that would follow the collapse of the French Revolutionary Wars and the Bonapartist empire they had unwittingly birthed. The Congress of Vienna was to inaugurate nearly 3 unbroken decades of conservative political triumph in Europe, for which Castlereagh was toasted by some and damned by others. The Chancellor of the Austrian Empire, Prince Clemens von Metternich, considered Castlereagh to be one of the great men of their generation. Von Metternich, too, is controversial, seen by many as one of the practical founding fathers of modern European conservatism. Lord Castlereagh knew he was despised by many, and as he grew older, he found that harder and harder to deal with it. He believed, too, that as the years passed, people in Ireland must have forgotten that the rebels of 1798 had been in league with the revolution in France. Truth be told, Castlereagh was being hopelessly naive or self-deluding if he thought that the memory of that fact would have made him popular with many people in Ireland. But as Castlereagh himself put it,
"With respect to Ireland, I know I shall never be forgiven. For what reason? Because I exerted myself to defend the people of Ireland from the conspiracy which surrounds them. My conduct has been the constant target of invective, but I think those who are acquainted with me will do me the justice of believing that I never had a cruel or unkind heart."
On what turned out to be his last visit home to Ireland, however, Castlereagh was cheered in its streets. George III, king from 1760 until his death in 1820, had been, as we have seen, a zealous opponent of Catholic emancipation, but his son, successor, and Castlereagh's friend, King George IV, was expected to support it, and he did. It was passed into law with the Catholic Relief Act of 1829. Knowing of the new king's sympathy for Catholic civil rights and Lord Castlereagh's friendship with that king, the two men were celebrated by large crowds when they visited Dublin in 1821. Clearly touched and surprised by this reception, Castlereagh wrote of his Dublin trip,
"I have not heard an unkind word from a single individual, and I have mixed with the people as much as I can. I am proud of my country."
But this happier mood, this revived spirits, didn't last. Once he was back in London, Lord Castlereagh's behaviour began to give more and more cause for concern. He was frustrated by what he saw as his failures. Catholic emancipation was coming, but it was coming a generation later than it had been promised. He had other large failures too, weighing on mind and conscience. Although he had used his position to help support the abolitionist cause in the British Empire and to help capture slave ships and liberate their victims before they could be trafficked further, Castlereagh had nonetheless failed to seriously advance any legislation that meaningfully undercut the institution of slavery in the empire. As Foreign Secretary, Castlereagh had, however, been looking forward to a diplomatic or official trip back to Vienna, scene of his greatest, as he saw it, triumph 7 years earlier, and of course home to his friend and ally Chancellor von Metternich, as well as being the city where Castlereagh's younger brother then lived. But then suddenly depression took that from him too, and the thought of this trip to which he had been so looking forward seemed suddenly to overwhelm him. Trying to cheer him up, a friend said, "Why not focus on this trip to Vienna?" To which Lord Castlereagh replied,
"At any other time I should have liked it very much, but I am quite worn out. Quite worn out." quite worn out. And this fresh load of responsibility is more than I can bear.
During a conversation with a medical doctor, Castlereagh seemed to ask an inordinate number of questions about the best way to end one's life. He ended that conversation by saying politely to the doctor,
"You must think me very ignorant, but I am rather curious about such matters."
The king's latest mistress disliked Lord Castlereagh, and he convinced himself that she was trying to turn King George against him. Then, at a state dinner in London, held in honour of the visiting Crown Princess of Denmark, Lord Castlereagh seemed erratic, paranoid, and angry. His friend and fellow guest at that dinner, Princess Dorothea von Leven, wife of the Russian ambassador, was startled by how aggressively he spoke at her as they were going through to dinner. When the Duke of Wellington, the famous British military commander and politician, who was also a fellow member of the Irish Ascendancy, appeared a little bit distant in conversation with Castlereagh, the latter became extremely distressed and told people that his friend Wellington must have found out a shameful secret about him. That was why he was being so cold. The Duke had to call to see Castlereagh personally to assure him that he'd simply been a bit off because he was distracted with a political matter. It had nothing to do with his friendship with Lord Castlereagh. Then, a scandal broke about Ireland, and Lord Castlereagh went over the edge completely. On a summer's evening, the Right Reverend and the Honourable Percy Jocelyn, His Grace the Bishop of Clocker, was caught in the back room of a pub in a compromising position with a handsome soldier. Homosexuality had been a death penalty offence since a law passed by Henry VIII in 1533, but that law was very seldom enforced. Still, it was enough to destroy lives and eviscerate careers. Bishop Jocelyn, like Lord Castlereagh, was a member of the Ascendancy in the north. His father was the Earl of Roden. One of their family estates was in Castlewellan, 30 miles from Belfast. The scandal of the Bishop of Clogher's homosexuality was so great that every Protestant bishop in the country was apparently being laughed at in the streets. Clogher had to resign, change his name, and go into hiding. Poems were made mocking him and the church. Some laughed. Many more shuddered in disgust. Public revulsion at the Bishop of Clogher's behaviour was intense. It was all anybody could talk about by the time Lord Castlereagh turned up for an audience with the King at Windsor Castle on the 8th of August, 5 days before he took his own life. From the moment Castlereagh walked in to see him, George IV could see something was very wrong. The Foreign Secretary, normally a model of dignity, could neither sit nor stand still, his speech equally frantic. Out of nowhere, Castlereagh burst into tears and confessed to the startled king that he had committed the same crime as the Bishop of Clogher. Somebody knew, Castlereagh rambled. People knew. He suspected that was what the Duke of Wellington must have found out. His reassurances notwithstanding didn't make sense. That's what he had to know. He had to have found that out. The king, due to depart the next day for a very important royal visit to Scotland, through which he hoped to build bridges with the remnants of the Jacobite cause, was shocked and tried to calm Castlereagh down. I'm not usually one who finds much to say by way of praise for George IV, but I have to say in this particular audience he does emerge with quite good intentions. He politely, tactfully pretended not to believe Castlereagh's confession and urged the Marquess to take a leave of absence, and above all else would he please see a doctor for his nerves. But Castlereagh kept repeating he was ruined and that he must flee, as the disgraced bishop had. He should go abroad into hiding. The king repeated that all he needed to do was take a few weeks off, a few months off, see a doctor, and go and rest in the countryside. One detail that we don't know for certain is whether or not Castlereagh was being blackmailed with exposure of his homosexuality. Princess Dorothea von Leven heard later that at that final audience with the king, Castlereagh actually showed George IV letters from his blackmailers, but Princess von Leven was never able to confirm whether or not that was true. Before leaving London for his country estate in Kent, as the king had suggested, Castlereagh told another friend, Mrs. Arbuthnot, that he had gone to a male brothel 3 years earlier and that he had been blackmailed about that ever since. Given Castlereagh's agitation, Mrs. Arbuthnot didn't know how much of that was true either. Crucially, however, Castlereagh's wife Amelia knew and later admitted in a letter to a friend that she believed that fear over being exposed by his blackmailers was what had prompted her husband's suicide. It seems, perhaps, it could have been a combination of short-term stresses, such as being targeted by Queen Caroline's more zealous supporters, then his feud with the king's mistress, and then, of course, the general inescapable stress of having a government post as high-ranking and important as Foreign Secretary, had all then perhaps fatally mixed with Castlereagh's long-term insecurities, mental ill health, possible guilt over the failure to pass Catholic emancipation in the wake of the Act of Union, failure too to substantially legislatively advance the anti-slavery cause, and hiding his sexuality for the entirety of his adult life while trying to fend off blackmailers. Only 2 days, and I say for all of his life because it is possible that detail that he told Mrs. Arbuthnot that he'd been blackmailed for the last 3 years since the visit to the brothel, her doubts about that may be justified. Because only 2 days after his suicide, one of Castlereagh's friends admitted to another that Lord Castlereagh had in fact been blackmailed throughout his entire political career about his homosexuality, and that finally, at the very end, he shattered under the pressure of it. Others who knew the late Marquess very well, including, I think tellingly, letters from and to his brother, who was then the British ambassador to Austria, were very careful as to what they put on paper solely about that. They're quite specific about what they call his delirium, about the nature of his wounds, but after being frank about that, one of the ambassador's correspondents then writes, "There is but one subject on which there remains anything to say, and that is the matter on which turned the different moments of his delirium. This I will reserve for future conversations when we meet." Lord Castlereagh, by then Lord Londonderry, major architect of the Act of Union and of the Congress of Vienna, was buried at Westminster Abbey. His title as Marquess of Londonderry passed to his younger brother Charles. The Irish politician Henry Grattan, a prominent anti-unionist and a general critic of Lord Castlereagh's politics, had once magnanimously said to his son, "Don't be hard on Castlereagh, for he too loves Ireland." Another Liberal opponent, the Member of Parliament Henry Brougham, who had debated many times with Castlereagh, said, "One can't help feeling a little for him. After being pitted against him for several years pretty regularly, it's like losing a connection suddenly. Also, he was a gentleman, and the only one amongst them," by which Brougham meant the Tories. A particularly kind, if unintended, tribute came from one of Lord Castlereagh's servants, who told the inquiry that they knew his employer was in some kind of distress because one day he spoke sharply to me. When pressed, the servant replied that it was so unlike the Marquess to speak rudely or dismissively to anybody, especially servants, that it meant something must have been very wrong with him that day. But politics does not always stop with death, and hearing that Castlereagh, who was played brilliantly in this episode by actor Jake Douglas, was buried at Westminster, his opponent Lord Byron suggested that the epitaph should read,
"Posterity will never survey a nobler grave than this."